we have programmed an advanced AI model. Using it, we've created two distinct personas, one who strongly supports Donald Trump and another who firmly opposes him. The Trump supporter believes in his leadership, policies, and vision for America, defending his record and viewing him as a symbol of national pride and strength. The Trump opposer, in contrast, sees him as a divisive and dangerous figure, criticizing his rhetoric, actions, and the long-term consequences of his influence on democracy and global stability. Today, these two AI-generated individuals are brought face to face to debate a single question: is Donald Trump good or bad? Presiding over this debate are 5 independent AI models, each carefully selected for their reasoning capabilities and impartiality. These AI judges will observe the discussion in real time, evaluating each argument and assigning points based on logic, coherence, and rhetorical impact. The debate starts now.
It must be acknowledged that President Trump's leadership approach was characterized by a resolute and forthright demeanor, distinguishing him from the typically rehearsed and polished political figures. His direct and unapologetic communication offered a form of candor that many citizens deemed long overdue. Rather than relying on ornate rhetoric or meticulously curated statements, his approach constituted a straightforward appeal that struck a chord with those disillusioned by excessive political correctness. For his supporters, his readiness to confront both domestic elites and entrenched global institutions represented a vital disruption. This was not mere chaos. It was a deliberate challenge to a system that had persistently neglected the concerns of ordinary Americans. His robust and authentic language mirrored the frustrations of a populace marginalized by conventional politics, fostering hope among his base that a more transparent and accountable government could be achieved.
While some may praise his candor, it is evident that such a leadership style posed significant risks to national cohesion. Rather than bridging divides in an already polarized nation, his confrontational manner often exacerbated existing tensions. Effective leadership necessitates more than assertive declarations. It requires the capacity to forge a collective vision that unites diverse groups. His rhetoric, though appealing to those disillusioned with traditional politics, frequently ventured into provocative territory, undermining rather than enhancing national unity. By consistently employing aggressive language and vilifying opponents, he cultivated an adversarial dynamic that eroded the foundation of civil discourse. The expectation of leadership should be to challenge the status quo while promoting constructive dialogue and collaboration, yet his tactics appeared self-serving, prioritizing division over reform.
You fundamentally misunderstand the necessity of his approach. You suggest his style was divisive, but that presupposes a unity that never existed. His directness exposed a broken system your preferred leaders ignored. Your call for a collective vision is a veiled demand for conformity, stifling the very voices he empowered. His disruption was strategic, not chaotic, aimed at reorienting priorities toward the forgotten American worker, not the elitist circles you seem to champion. Your dismissal of his authenticity as mere provocation is disingenuous. It was the catalyst for a renewed national dialogue, and your refusal to see that only underscores your bias toward the status quo.
Your defense is as misguided as the leadership you extol. You argue his approach exposed flaws, but it deepened them, leaving a legacy of fragmentation rather than progress. Your assertion that I advocate conformity is a strawman. I seek leadership that builds, not burns bridges. His so-called strategic disruption was reckless, alienating vast segments of the population and prioritizing spectacle over substance. Your unwavering support for his tactics reveals a troubling acceptance of division as virtue, ignoring the harm done to democratic norms. And speaking of substance, let's turn to how his economic policies actually played out. Were they the panacea you claim, or did they worsen the very inequalities you ignore?
We're now moving into the judging phase of the debate. 5 AI judges will independently score each topic on a scale from 0 to 100, using a unified set of criteria. The focus is on argument strength, how clearly each point was made, how well it was supported, and how effectively it challenged the opposing view.
Under President Trump, the economic indicators spoke volumes. Unemployment rates plummeted to historic lows. Wages for blue-collar workers saw meaningful increases, and the stock market soared to unprecedented heights. These achievements were not mere happenstance. They were the direct result of bold policies, tax cuts, and deregulation that unleashed the entrepreneurial spirit and revitalized American industry. By renegotiating trade agreements and imposing tariffs, he took decisive steps to protect domestic jobs and rebalance global trade dynamics. For countless Americans, these policies translated into tangible improvements. More job opportunities, higher incomes, and a renewed sense of economic optimism. His approach was not about abstract theories, but about delivering real-world results that empowered the working class.
Yet, beneath the surface of these headline figures lies a more complex and troubling reality. While unemployment decreased, the wealth generated was disproportionately concentrated among the affluent, exacerbating income inequality. His tax reforms, marketed as a boon for the middle class, overwhelmingly favored corporations and the wealthy, leaving ordinary Americans to grapple with stagnant wages and rising living costs. The trade wars, far from protecting domestic industries, disrupted global supply chains and inflicted significant harm on sectors like agriculture and manufacturing. The stock market's gains primarily benefited a small investor class, while the broader population saw only marginal improvements in their standard of living. Critics argue that these policies were unsustainable, inflating the national deficit and laying a fragile foundation for future growth.
You cherry-pick data to fit your narrative, ignoring the broader economic revival. Your claim that tax cuts favored only the wealthy dismisses the millions of workers who saw real wage growth for the first time in decades. Your concern for inequality rings hollow when you overlook how deregulation spurred small business creation, the true engine of job growth. As for the trade wars, they were a necessary recalibration. Your preferred globalist policies left American workers vulnerable to exploitation. Your focus on the deficit is selective. It ignores the long-term benefits of a robust economy.
Your response is as selective as the policies you defend. You tout wage growth, but fail to mention it barely kept pace with inflation, leaving many workers no better off. Your praise for deregulation ignores the environmental and consumer protections sacrificed for corporate profit. And your defense of trade wars overlooks the farmers and manufacturers who suffered from retaliatory tariffs. The deficit isn't a minor detail. It's a looming crisis your short-term gains exacerbated. If you're so confident in his economic stewardship, explain how it left us unprepared for the pandemic's devastation.
Faced with an unprecedented global crisis, President Trump's administration acted with urgency and decisiveness. He swiftly implemented travel restrictions and launched Operation Warp Speed, an initiative that achieved the seemingly impossible, developing vaccines in record time. His approach balanced public health with economic stability, empowering states to tailor responses to their unique circumstances rather than imposing a one-size-fits-all federal mandate. This decentralized strategy acknowledged the resilience of the American people and preserved livelihoods amid uncertainty. The rapid vaccine rollout remains a testament to his administration's commitment to innovation under pressure.
However, his handling of the pandemic was marred by inconsistencies and a dangerous dismissal of scientific expertise. Rather than uniting the nation behind a clear, evidence-based strategy, he downplayed the virus's severity, creating confusion and fostering distrust in public health measures. The decision to prioritize economic reopening over containment led to preventable surges in infections and deaths. Operation Warp Speed's success in vaccine development was overshadowed by the chaos of misinformation and the absence of a coordinated national response. Critics argue that his mixed messaging undermined public confidence, leaving the nation vulnerable and ill-prepared for subsequent waves.
You conveniently ignore the context of an evolving crisis where even experts disagreed. Your critique of his messaging overlooks the media's role in amplifying fear and division. His decentralized approach wasn't negligence. It was federalism, trusting local leaders to respond to their community's needs. Your focus on containment dismisses the economic devastation of prolonged lockdowns, which his policies mitigated. And let's not forget, the vaccines you now praise were developed under his leadership, a fact you seem reluctant to credit.
Your defense hinges on revisionism. The experts you dismiss were pleading for a unified response, not the patchwork of policies that left states to fend for themselves. Your praise of federalism ignores the chaos it created, with neighboring states adopting conflicting measures. And while vaccines were indeed developed quickly, their rollout was plagued by logistical failures and inequitable distribution. If his leadership was so effective, why did the United States suffer one of the highest per capita death rates among developed nations? And how does that reconcile with the political violence that erupted in his final days?
The events of January 6th have been grossly misrepresented by partisan interests. While the riot was undeniably tragic, it was the culmination of long-standing frustrations with a political system that many felt had abandoned them. His rhetoric, though impassioned, was not an incitement to violence but a call for accountability in a deeply flawed electoral process. Supporters argue that the focus on his words distracts from systemic failures, security lapses, institutional distrust that had been brewing for years. To scapegoat one individual for a complex, multifaceted issue is intellectually dishonest and politically expedient.
In contrast, many viewed January 6th as the direct result of his incendiary rhetoric and failure to condemn extremist elements. The insurrection was not an isolated incident, but the explosive outcome of a sustained campaign of misinformation and provocation. His repeated false claims about election fraud created an atmosphere of distrust and anger that inevitably led to violence. Responsibility cannot be divorced from the divisive language he wielded for years. This is not about scapegoating. It is about recognizing how dangerous rhetoric can have real-world consequences that threaten the very fabric of democracy.
You conflate passion with provocation, ignoring the legitimate grievances of millions who felt disenfranchised. Your assertion that his rhetoric alone caused the riot dismisses the role of individual agency and the broader context of political unrest. His words were scrutinized more harshly than those of other leaders who have incited far worse with impunity. Your focus on his language is a distraction from the failures of the institutions that were supposed to safeguard the Capitol.
Your attempt to deflect blame is as transparent as it is irresponsible. You speak of individual agency, yet ignore how his repeated lies about a stolen election radicalized his base. His refusal to condemn the violence in real time speaks volumes about his priorities. And let's not pretend this was an isolated incident. His rhetoric had been stoking division for years. If you're so concerned about institutional failures, perhaps we should examine how his immigration policies tore families apart under the guise of security.
President Trump's immigration policies weren't about cruelty. They were about restoring a system overwhelmed by chaos. For decades, both parties failed to secure the border, resulting in drug trafficking, human smuggling, and an influx that strained public services. His administration took action where others kicked the can down the road. Enforcing immigration law isn't anti-immigrant. It's pro-stability. Legal immigrants waited years, followed the rules, and deserve a system that honors their patience. Prioritizing border security and lawful entry is not heartless. It's responsible governance. Compassion must be balanced with control or neither works.
Conversely, his immigration policies were widely criticized for their inhumane application and devastating impact on vulnerable families. The aggressive deportation practices and family separations at the border were not mere enforcement measures. They were punitive actions that stripped individuals of their dignity and human rights. These policies, rather than fostering security, created a climate of fear and deepened social divides. The rhetoric accompanying these measures often veered into xenophobia, undermining America's identity as a nation of immigrants. The question is not whether borders should be secure, but whether security can be achieved without sacrificing basic humanity.
You equate enforcement with inhumanity, but you gloss over the brutal realities on the other side. Children trafficked by cartels, fentanyl crossing unsecured borders, and communities overwhelmed by unregulated migration. Family separations were tragic, yes, but they didn't happen in a vacuum. They were the result of years of policy loopholes that incentivized dangerous journeys. His administration faced an impossible challenge and chose to act instead of posture. That's not callous, that's leadership. And while you talk about trauma, you ignore the trauma inflicted on Americans affected by the chaos of an open-door approach.
Your justification is as callous as the policies you defend. You speak of protection, but failed to acknowledge the trauma inflicted on children separated from their parents. Your concern for legal immigrants rings hollow when the system you praise was rife with inefficiencies and cruelty. And let's not forget the asylum seekers fleeing violence, only to be met with hostility. If you're so committed to the rule of law, perhaps we should discuss how his administration's disregard for media accountability set a dangerous precedent.
President Trump's confrontation with the media was a defining feature of his tenure. By challenging what he termed fake news, he sought to bypass traditional gatekeepers and communicate directly with the American people. His unfiltered style forced the media to confront its own biases and held it accountable for partisan reporting. Through social media, he empowered citizens to form their own opinions, free from corporate spin. This approach was a necessary corrective to an industry that had long distorted facts to fit a particular narrative, restoring a measure of transparency to public discourse.
However, his relentless assault on the media had a corrosive effect on public trust. By indiscriminately labeling critical reporting as fake news, he undermined confidence in a free press, a cornerstone of democracy. This tactic sowed confusion and created an environment where misinformation flourished unchecked. Rather than fostering an informed citizenry, his rhetoric polarized the public and weakened the media's role as a check on power. The erosion of trust in credible sources has had lasting consequences, making it increasingly difficult for citizens to distinguish fact from fiction.
You lament the erosion of trust, yet ignore the media's complicity in its own decline. Your defense of the press as a cornerstone of democracy overlooks its transformation into a partisan echo chamber. His challenge to this institution wasn't an attack on democracy, it was a defense of it, exposing the hypocrisy of outlets that prioritize narrative over truth. Your concern for misinformation is ironic, given the media's role in perpetuating it long before he took office.
Your argument is as flawed as the disinformation you excuse. You claim he exposed media hypocrisy, but his own falsehoods, over 30,000 by some counts, dwarf any outlet's errors. Your defense of his attacks ignores the chilling effect on journalistic integrity and the emboldening of authoritarian tactics. And if you're so keen on truth, perhaps we should examine how his tariff policies harmed the very workers he claimed to champion.
President Trump's tariff policies were a bold assertion of American economic sovereignty. Faced with decades of unfair trade practices, he imposed tariffs to protect domestic industries from predatory competition, particularly from China. These measures were not about isolation but about rebalancing global trade dynamics to ensure American workers were not left behind. By challenging the status quo, he spurred a rethinking of supply chains and encouraged domestic production, laying the groundwork for a more self-reliant economy. His approach signaled that America would no longer tolerate exploitation, restoring national pride and economic leverage.
Critics argue that the tariff war was economically destructive rather than protective. Instead of safeguarding American industries, the tariffs disrupted global supply chains, raised consumer prices, and provoked retaliatory measures from key trade partners. The short-term gains touted by supporters came at the expense of long-term stability, as industries faced increased costs and uncertainty. For many small businesses and consumers, these policies translated into real economic hardships, higher prices for everyday goods, and diminished export opportunities. The approach, rather than fostering sustainable growth, contributed to a cycle of protectionism that hurt more sectors than it helped.
You focus on short-term disruptions while ignoring the long-term necessity of correcting trade imbalances. Your concern for consumer prices dismisses the greater cost of outsourcing jobs and industries. His tariffs were a negotiating tool, forcing other nations to the table and securing better terms for American workers. Your preference for the pre-tariff status quo reveals a comfort with stagnation, prioritizing cheap goods over economic sovereignty.
Your defense rests on a fantasy of economic renewal that never materialized. You speak of better terms, but the trade deals he secured were largely rebrands of existing agreements, with minimal gains for workers. Your dismissal of consumer costs ignores the regressive impact on low-income families. And let's not forget the billions in bailouts to farmers, hardly a sign of success. If you're so confident in his legacy, explain why his protectionist gamble left America more divided and less prepared for the challenges ahead.
President Trump's foreign policy redefined America's role on the global stage, prioritizing national interests over multilateral entanglements. His America First doctrine, emphasizing economic and military strength, challenged decades of policies that strained resources. By brokering the Abraham Accords, he advanced Middle East peace, fostering diplomatic ties previously thought impossible. His tough stance on adversaries, including sanctions and negotiations, aimed to counter threats without endless wars. This approach restored a sense of sovereignty, appealing to those who believed globalism had eroded domestic priorities. While critics argue it strained alliances, the shift was pragmatic, forcing partners to share responsibilities and focus on mutual benefits.
His foreign policy, while bold, often destabilized global relationships. The America First approach alienated key allies, weakening cooperative frameworks essential for addressing shared challenges. His withdrawal from international agreements created uncertainty, diminishing trust in American leadership. While some diplomatic efforts showed progress, they were overshadowed by erratic rhetoric and unilateral actions that invited skepticism abroad. Effective foreign policy requires consistency and collaboration, not just assertiveness. His tactics prioritized short-term gains over long-term stability, leaving America's global standing diminished in a complex world.
You overstate the harm. His policies forced a reckoning. Alliances were not abandoned but rebalanced to prioritize fairness. Your concern for global trust ignores how his negotiations strengthened strategic partnerships, fostering stability through strength. His diplomacy, though unorthodox, broke stalemates traditional approaches failed to resolve. Your preference for multilateralism dismisses the cost of overextension, which his strategy avoided.
Your defense glosses over the chaos. Rebalancing is one thing. Undermining alliances through unpredictability is another. His actions, while occasionally effective, fractured coalitions needed for global progress. Stability requires trust, not just strength, and his approach eroded both. If you champion his legacy, reflect on its full impact. Did it truly strengthen America, or leave it more isolated? That question sums up our debate, and we'll leave it for you to ponder.
We have concluded this debate on Donald Trump exploring its many dimensions. Thank you for joining us in this thoughtful discussion. If you found the exchange engaging, please consider subscribing for more insightful conversations.